Hello, hello. I'm Casey.
And I'm Fallon.
And this is
Render the Darkness.
Spot on.
Did good that time.
I almost want to stop the recording just to hear us do that so perfectly again.
Do it.
No, I'm not going to do it.
Oh, well.
Okay. So, this is episode 3 of our podcast. And this case is going to be done by me today.
Yay.
Casey. Yeah. Before we get started, I wanted to do something a little unorthodox for the type of podcast we're striving for here, which is true crime, paranormal, as well as strange and unusual. And I promise we will get to things other than true crime. We will get to the paranormal, strange, and unusual very soon. Anyways, I wanted to give a worldly fact, something that you may or may not know, but hopefully it'll let you walk away not only feeling like you've learned something, but also it'll give your brain something else to toss around to help with the easement of some of the details you're going to hear in the case. We're going to be covering some pretty heavy topics in some of these, so I just thought maybe it might help when you walk away from the episode to have something else rolling around in there besides just the details that might give you something else to fall on.
Yeah, give your brain something else to kind of focus on.
I mean, I obviously want you to focus on the details of the case as well, but I don't want that to be the only thing rolling around in your mind. Anyway, if you like that I threw this in, I'm going to have a poll on the episode that you can go in and vote. If you like it, check yes. If you don't like it, check no. It's not going to hurt my feelings. It's just something I'm trying to see if it helps or it doesn't help. So, today's worldly fact for this episode is the world's smallest mammal, is the bumblebee bat, which I had actually never heard of before, so I had to look it up, and they are adorable. So if you have not ever looked it up, I highly recommend you Google it.
They are adorable.
They're so little.
I want one.
So
I want 10.
tiny.
10 bumblebee bats.
They're so cute. Okay, so onto the case that we're going to be discussing today. This is the case of Albert Dekker. Sure some of you out there have heard of Albert Dekker just from his accolades. He was an actor and a politician. Anyway, before we get into the case, I want to give a content warning and just let you know ahead of time. This episode contains some very graphic and explicit information regarding sexual scenarios and situations. For anyone who may need to skip over these parts of the case, I will tell you before anything is mentioned containing any of the details regarding that, so you have a chance to stop it or skip it or whatever you're feeling compelled to do in that moment. That being said, let's get started on the case. Born Thomas Albert Eck on December 20th, 1905 in Brooklyn, New York, and I would just like to note here that I did not mean to do back-to-back cases where the main person of topic was born in Brooklyn. I promise that was purely coincidence. His parents' names were Albert Daniel Eck and Grace, also called Gracie, Dekker Eck. He had 2 siblings, a brother named Robert Skidmore Eck, born in 1909, and a sister named Catherine G. Eck, born in 1912. Dekker attended Richmond Hill High School, where he had appeared in stage productions. After he graduated high school, he went on to attend Bowdoin College in Maine, where he majored in pre-med. Some sources said he wanted to be a doctor, and other sources said psychologist or psychiatrist. Not really sure which of those he actually went for. It did say that he did graduate, but he ended up abandoning this path when he was encouraged by a fellow alumnus to pursue acting after they watched him do a couple of stage performances. I couldn't find the name of the person, but they did end up writing Dekker a letter of introduction and told Dekker to take the letter to a man named Albert Lunt. Albert Lunt was really impressed by Dekker, and he helped him get his start in theater. His official debut in acting professionally was in 1927 with a Cincinnati stock company. He quickly began starring in Broadway. He played multiple roles in the production of Marco Millions. It's a play by Eugene O'Neill, where he played opposite of Lunt. He would continue to perform in theater until 1937, which is the year he made his first film, a movie called The Great Garrick. To back up on the dates just a little bit and discuss a little of what was going on in his personal life in between that time, on April 4th, 1929, he would marry a former actress by the name of Esther Guiney. I really hope I said that right, and the couple would go on to have 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Their sons' names were John and Benjamin, and their daughter's name was Jan. The couple stayed married until 1964. Sadly, Albert and Esther would experience some major tragedy in their marriage. In April of 1957, their son John, who was only 16 at the time, would fatally shoot himself with a .22 rifle. From what I could find, it said that John had been working on a homemade silencer for the gun, and apparently while doing so, the gun somehow went off, shooting him in his right eye.
Oh gosh, that's terrible.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine that at all.
No.
Ultimately, the couple would divorce in 1964. Sorry, I'm going to be jumping back and forth a little bit on this case. Back to his career, which his career expanded over 30 years, and he had quite a lot of accolades. Dekker appeared in over 100 films altogether and guest starred and appeared on numerous TV series. He played in movies such as The Gentleman's Agreement, 2 Years Before the Mast, East of Eden, Suddenly Last Summer, Strange Cargo, and The Man in the Iron Mask, and that's just to name a few.
I have heard of the Man in the Iron Mask.
Yeah, one of my favorites. He actually won a Tony for his portrayal of the Duke of Norfolk in A Man of All Seasons. He was most active in film during the 1920s through the 1960s, but he did continue to perform in theater as well. He actually replaced Lee J. Cobb in the role of Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, and he was apparently so convincing in that role that in one scene where Dekker's character, and this is a content warning here, his character commits suicide. His son, who was 9 at the time, had to run backstage and make sure his dad was okay. When it came to his acting career, he really excelled in character roles. He really seemed to enjoy playing the villain. He was once quoted as saying, quote, "Who wants to be America's sweetheart?" End quote. He also often said he chose the villain role more because it was more challenging to play a quote-unquote heavy than a hero. Another film role he was really recognized for was a mad scientist in the film Dr. Cyclops, which was a 1940 horror film. Then there was one called The Killers he did in 1946, where he was cast as a criminal mastermind. He received even more recognition in 1955 in a film called Kiss Me Deadly, where he played an atomic fuel dealer. So we're going to jump back to theater for a second. He also received really high reviews in New York opposite Spencer Tracy in a play called Conflict, and in the role of the worn matinee idol in Grand Hotel. Dekker often expressed how much he loved performing in theater. He was once quoted as saying, "New York is a small town. Everyone on the street stops an actor to say hello when he's in a current show." End quote. But acting wasn't the only thing that Dekker was passionate about. He was also really passionate about politics. He was a very strong Democrat. In fact, his interest in politics is what led for him to run for progressive state assemblyman in California in 1944, which he won by a landslide. He was well known for supporting unwed and indigent mothers' rights. He also attempted to introduce a bill against capital punishment, but it was denied because they claimed it would, quote, "take the fun out of a murder trial," end quote.
That is terrible.
It is terrible. Dekker only stayed in that position for 2 years before returning to acting. Decker's trouble in life really seemed to start in the 50s, which is when he began to openly and publicly denounce Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican. Because Dekker believed that McCarthy was on a witch hunt for communists, he was quoted as saying, and he began openly calling McCarthy, quote unquote, insane. After this happened, Dekker began receiving death threats, and people started really expressing their new doubt about Decker's political views. As a result, it didn't take long for Dekker to be completely blacklisted. He was no longer able to find work anywhere as an actor, and to add more tragedy to Decker's beginning stages of what some considered his downfall, this was all happening around the same time that Decker's son's death had occurred.
Well, that's sad. Excuse me, goodness.
However, when the 60s rolled around and the political atmosphere had shifted, Dekker was able to find work again. Shortly after was when he landed a role in Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch. I really hope I said that right. So this would actually become Decker's last acting role before he passed away. He passed away a year before the film was actually released.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah. He also had met a former model named Geraldine Saunders. She would later go on to write The Love Boats, said to be loosely based on their relationship. I'm not sure of the validity of that. I only saw it in one resource. But he met her while appearing in A Man for All Seasons, which I mentioned earlier. And they would become engaged. Unfortunately, the time frame in which he met her was the same time it was suspected that Dekker had begun seeing a man named Dr. Max Jacobson, who was a New York physician often referred to as Dr. Feelgood, and was known to administer what was called at the time vitamin cocktails. It would later be discovered that these cocktails were laced with amphetamines. In a 1999 documentary, Decker's son Benjamin would say of the drug use, quote, "It just gave him a tremendous boost of energy. He would tell me that he was able to stay up 24, 36, 40 hours at a time. I think in the long term, the drugs were very detrimental to his health, and I think that was the beginning of his somewhat demise," end quote.
Yeah, imagine. I mean, anybody stays up for 40 hours at a time. I mean, that's got to be really bad on your health because, I mean, that can mess you up psychologically and start hallucinating and terrible.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the evening of what is assumed to be Decker's death. It was the evening of May 2nd, 1968. It was a Thursday night. Dekker and Geraldine went on a date. They attended the opening of a play called The Latent Heterosexual, written by Zero Mostel, and it was being performed at Hollywood Huntington Hartford Theater. And later, Saunders would say of their evening at the theater that Dekker was in fine spirits. Before Dekker and Saunders parted ways for the evening, they made plans to go out again the next night, Friday evening. So she tried to call him later that evening to confirm their plans, but he didn't answer. So she tried to call numerous times, and still no answer. She tried again Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, and still no answer. So first thing Sunday morning, she made her way over to his apartment where she's seen many notes pinned to the door from his friends and colleagues who were also trying to get a hold of him. So she followed suit. She wrote a note and she slipped it under his door. She went home and waited for his call, but when it still hadn't come, she went back to his apartment, only to find her note was still there. At this point, she ran to the manager. The manager was able to unlock the door, and the manager and Saunders entered the apartment together. As they looked around the apartment, everything initially seemed to be in perfect order. However, when they made it to the bathroom, it was somehow strangely chained from the inside. I'm not sure how they managed to get in the door or how they managed to get the door open, but when they did, Saunders was not prepared for what she was about to see. Here's where I'm going to insert my content warning. This next part goes into very graphic details and speaks about topics referring to sexual content. Dekker was found very clearly deceased. He was completely nude and kneeling inside the bathtub. He had 2 hypodermic needles hanging out of him, one in each arm. He had what's called a hangman's noose around his neck, but it wasn't tightened tight enough that it would or even could have strangled him. A scarf was covering his eyes. He had what detectives and a lot of the articles referred to as a horse's bit in his mouth. It was said to have had a rubber ball in his mouth with metal wire around it. The bit had what police referred to as reins tied tightly behind his head. He also had 2 leather thongs stretched between the leather belts that encircled around his neck and chest. He had a 3rd belt around his waist. He was tied with rope that stretched to his ankles, where it was tied in what one article referred to as a lumber hitch. I didn't know what that was. I've never heard of that, so I had to look it up. And apparently, it's more commonly referred to as a timber hitch. It's a specific type of knot used to attach a single length of rope around a cylinder object, so they use it to like pull trees and stuff.
Okay, I was going to ask what that was because I've never heard of that before. A lumber hitch?
Yeah. The end of the rope, which also ran up his side, was wrapped around his wrist several times and was actually being held by Dekker with both hands. Both of his wrists had handcuffs clasped around them. He also had 2 hypodermic needle puncture marks on his right buttock, and written above the marks were the word whip, written in lipstick, as well as drawings of the sun. Around both of his nipples, sun rays had been drawn. On his thorax was the words "Make me suck," and written on his chest were the words "cocksucker" and "slave." He also had a vagina drawn on his lower abdomen.
Oh, gosh.
And it was quickly determined that he had been deceased since Friday, given the position and color of his body. Shockingly, even after finding him in this incredibly precarious situation, the detectives tried to label his death as suicide.
How?
I have no idea. But they said it was mostly due to the lack of evidence of a forced entry or any kind of a struggle. However, the coroner rejected that theory, citing there was no evidence to support it. So
coroner.
Well, so instead, the coroner labeled it an quote-unquote accidental death.
How can that be
So, it should be noted that finding his body was not the only thing about the scene for the detectives to look into. For example, it was discovered that there were actually several things missing. He had a really expensive camera, was never found. He also had a tape recorder that he used to practice his lines for any of his upcoming roles. That was missing. And also, Saunders, she explained to detectives that her and Dekker were actually in the process of buying a house.
Oh, nice.
And he'd only been staying in that apartment for a week.
Oh,
and it was supposed to be a temporary stay in that apartment, just long enough for their house to go through escrow. And for whatever reason, Dekker was determined to pay cash for this house. So she claimed that he had been bringing his paychecks home, like in cash. So she estimated that he had to have had around $70,000 in the apartment.
Good God.
That was also missing. He had just come home from filming on The Wild Bunch with a $40,000 paycheck.
Dang. That's quite a bit of money, but
the
I'm going to
money was gone.
Interject here. So you said that there was a camera and a recorder missing?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if he was maybe into something that a lot of people didn't really know about, that he was trying to keep secret, and maybe it was recorded and the other person took it with them as kind of like a trophy so they can like watch over and over again. Like maybe it wasn't an accident.
That's a really good lead into what the next part of the conversation is going to be about. So,
okay.
So when it originally came out that his death was going to be ruled a suicide, before it was rejected by the coroner, many people came forward in Dekker's defense, claiming that he was known as a happy man with a love for life. He was set to be married the next month. He was in the process of buying a house.
Yeah, there's no way he would have done that.
One of his colleagues, Paul Lucas, came forward in Dekker's defense and declared, quote, "He was a man of culture and breeding and would never leave the world in such a shambles," end quote. When his co-stars from the Wild Bunch heard the news, who were actually still in Mexico, wrapping up the filming on the Wild Bunch, they claimed he was the life of the party on set, and they were some of the people who he was around the most leading up to the time of his death, so they would probably know if he was showing any signs of...
You would think they might, catch some flags or red flags or something, maybe.
So it was really smart on the part of the coroner, to reject the notion of suicide, because it was immediately heavily refuted.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with the coroner there. Not about the accident part, but...
Well, I say that, but, I also read... There was also some resources that claimed that Dekker had been showing some erratic behavior on the set of The Wild Bunch. With some of them claiming that he was a nut, and that, there was one article that said something about him having brought a 13-year-old on the set and claimed that she was his wife and that he was going to retire so that he could go take care of... I don't remember who they said. I think the indigenous people, I believe, is what it said he was going to retire and go help take care of.
Okay.
So
Strange.
There's different sources that claim different things as far as his behavior on the set of The Wild Bunch. But they all say that he had a zest for life, that he was the life of the set.
Yeah.
So they all stayed in that line. But... there is no doubt that there were many things that didn't make sense with what ended up being the actual cause of death, which was listed as an accidental death. Many people and even newspapers wondered things like, if he was alone, how could he legibly write on his own backside?
I agree with that.
I also agree with that. It was confirmed that he was injected with drugs, but by the time his body was found, the drugs were no longer able to be identified, so they don't know what kind of drugs he was injected with. But I would like to note that Dekker was a pretty big guy. He was 6'3" and 240 pounds.
Dang.
Saunders believed that he could have only been bound and choked if he was unconscious. So after reading the part where she said that, it kind of made me wonder were the drugs intended to debilitate him?
That, or like I said earlier, like maybe he was into some things that people didn't know about, and maybe he wanted the other person to do it, or he did it, and it just kind of got out of hand, went too far, and
well,
he died.
On that note,
excuse me.
Let's move on to some of the theories surrounding his death.
All right.
So before I give you Saunders' theory, I would like to also back it up just a little and say that the apartment that he was renting, he chose that apartment for a very specific reason, and that is because his friend was one of the managers of that apartment.
Gotcha. So
Saunders, putting that kind of together, she believed that he let somebody that he knew in. And ironically, after Dekker's death, the friend, quote unquote, manager, he disappeared. Nobody could ever find him. So she was always convinced that he had something to do.
Yeah, that definitely doesn't look good.
With it. But that was never proven.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Some people thought maybe it was an assassination deriving from something surrounding his political complications that he had had. The police at one point threw around the idea that he was a closet homosexual, having secret relations with male prostitutes, and maybe while they were spending quote-unquote time together, something went wrong. So kind of on the line of what you were thinking.
I can see that.
They actually did investigate that theory, but nothing led to any part of that being true. Lastly, the coroner had a theory of his own. He believed he passed away due to autoerotic asphyxiation, which is where an orgasm is achieved by pushing the brinks of death. He claimed a lot of what happened with Dekker was common with this particular cause of death. But of course, that theory also could not be proven. Despite all of the evidence and the information, and despite Saunders claiming that a detective at one point even let it slip to her that they thought he was murdered, the police would never reverse Dekker's cause of death, and neither would the coroner. And it remains a mystery to this day.
Okay, so I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you said Saunders said that he had like $70,000 at his house. Like, did anybody else know that, or was she the only one that knew about that money?
I did read in an article where it was said that he was pretty trusting of people.
Okay.
So it is possible that it wasn't known if anybody else knew, but it is definitely possible that he had said something to somebody and somebody might have known. But if they did, it was never proven that anybody else knew. But yeah, that is the case of Albert Dekker. And I know I put a lot about his career in there, but that's just because I feel like with his death being so bizarre in detail that it's possible that could very easily overshadow all of the other information. And I just kind of wanted to make sure that all of his achievements and accolades that I could find were the first thing mentioned, so that hopefully it stays present in the forefront of people's minds, despite the unusual circumstances surrounding his death.
Yeah, that's definitely an unusual, tragic way to go. It's just, it's also bad that they never figured out what happened, like what really happened.
No.
I mean, I'm going to stick with what I said earlier. I think that somebody was there with him, somebody did it to him, whether it be an accident on purpose.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And, to be honest, it doesn't, from what I read and the articles that I looked at, and I could be completely wrong, but just from my interpretation, it doesn't seem like the police really put a whole lot of effort into disputing the cause of death or the claim of how he died.
Yeah. You were saying, it kind of sounded like, well, this is what it is, we're done.
Yeah. Just really tragic.
Yeah.
It's a really tragic way to go.
Very, very.
So that was my case on Albert Dekker. If you liked that case, or you've listened to our previous cases and you like what you hear and you would like to hear more, please follow us on Spotify and Amazon Music. We also have a TikTok that we've just started under Render the Darkness, and that's where we're going to be doing our live adventures. We can't go live yet. We don't have enough followers, but when we do, we will go live. But for now, we're posting our recordings of our adventures. We're going to be staying and visiting haunted houses, graveyards, forests, things like that. Yep. And uploading that to our TikTok. So if that's something you think you'll be interested in, we would love for you to follow us there. Of course, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call that.
I'm going to go Twitter because that's what I know about.
There you go. So yeah, we really appreciate your support. We appreciate you spending your time with us today and every other day that you spend your time with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated.
And again, like we've said in all the other cases, if you have any case recommendations, which we actually have received some, my next case is going to be a listener recommendation. And it does not matter where you are from. If there's something local to you or just something that you know about that you haven't ever heard covered, or maybe you have, but it just hasn't been covered a lot and you would like to hear it done again, please feel free to reach out. Our email is renderthedarknesspod@gmail.com. And you can always comment on episodes and communicate with us that way.
Yep.
And I think that's it.
Yeah, I think so.
So,
thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for hanging out. And once again, we are
Render the darkness. Bye.
Bye.
No, that didn't record.